The moment my quiet suburban driveway turned into a crime scene, I knew this wasn't going to end normally. It started with a scream, sharp and loud, cutting through a calm Saturday afternoon like a siren that didn't belong. I looked up from washing my car to see a woman storming toward me, phone already pressed to her ear, face twisted with rage. Before I could say a word, she shouted the sentence that would change everything, "Yes, I'd like to report an illegal obstruction. He's blocking my driveway." I wasn't blocking anything. My car was parked squarely on my own property, exactly where it had been for years. But logic doesn't matter when entitlement takes the wheel. She paced back and forth dramatically, pointing at my driveway as if it were a crime scene, making sure her voice carried so every neighbor could hear. Curtains moved. Porch doors cracked open. The audience was assembling. I stayed calm, because calm is something you learn when your job requires it. I asked her, politely, what the problem was. She ignored me completely, turning her back and speaking louder into the phone. She described me as aggressive, claimed I was threatening her, and added a few creative details that were pure fiction. Each word tightened the knot in my stomach, not because I was scared, but because I knew exactly how the system worked. This wasn't her first call. You could tell by the confidence, the performance, the way she nodded as if she knew the script by heart. She expected flashing lights. She expected handcuffs. She expected me to apologize or panic. What she didn't expect was patience. While she ranted, my mind drifted to the badge locked inside my house. The one I hadn't worn all weekend. The one that made the situation so absurd it almost felt unreal. I was off duty, enjoying my day, until she decided to weaponize emergency services over a parking spot she didn't own. When she finally hung up, she smiled. Not a friendly smile. A victorious one. "You're in big trouble," she said confidently. "I just called 911. I looked at her, then at the neighbors watching, then back at her again. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was going to be a lesson. The wait after she called 911 felt longer than it actually was. She stood there with her arms crossed, chin raised, like a judge who had already made up her mind. Every few seconds, she glanced at her phone, then back at me, clearly expecting me to panic. Instead, I leaned against my car and said nothing. Silence unsettles people like her more than arguments ever could. Neighbors continued to gather. One man pretended to check his mailbox for the third time. A woman across the street held her phone just a little too high, probably recording. Suburban streets are quiet, but drama carries far when boredom is listening. I could feel the tension thickening, the way it does right before something snaps. She broke the silence first. "You know," she said loudly, making sure everyone heard, "people like you think the rules don't apply to you." I asked calmly what she meant. She scoffed and said I was trespassing, blocking access, and being intentionally hostile. Each accusation grew more exaggerated, as if repeating them might turn them into facts. I tried once more to reason with her. I explained that the driveway was mine, that my car was registered to this address, and that there was no obstruction whatsoever. She laughed, an exaggerated, mocking sound, and waved me off. "Tell it to the police," she said. "They'll handle you." That word "handle" said everything. This wasn't about a driveway. It was about control. About summoning authority to punish someone who refused to bend. I'd seen this behavior before, just usually from the other side of the batch. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to rise. Her posture changed instantly. Shoulders back. Smirk wider. She glanced at the neighbors, clearly enjoying the attention. "Hear that?" she said. "That's consequences." As the sound grew closer, I felt a strange mix of frustration and curiosity. Frustration that emergency resources were being wasted on nonsense. Curiosity about how she would react when reality finally caught up. I debated going inside to grab my badge, but decided against it. Let this play out naturally. The patrol car turned onto our street, lights flashing but siren cutting off. It rolled slowly, deliberately, until it stopped right in front of my driveway. The officer stepped out, scanning the scene. Before he could speak, she rushed forward, launching into her story with dramatic urgency. And that's when I noticed something important. The officer recognized me. The officer's eyes widened just enough to tell me he knew exactly who I was. It wasn't surprise so much as sudden awareness, the kind that snaps everything into focus. He stopped mid-step, straightened his posture, and gave a small nod that only I noticed. The woman didn't. She was too busy unloading her rehearsed outrage, pointing at me like I'd committed a felony in broad daylight. "He's been threatening me," she said, voice shaking on command. "He blocked my driveway and refused to move. I feel unsafe." The officer raised a hand gently, signaling her to pause. He asked for her name, then asked her to explain where the obstruction was. She pointed again, dramatically, to my parked car. The same car that had not moved all afternoon. The same car fully inside my driveway. The officer glanced at it, then back at me, then down at his notepad. I kept my hands visible and my tone neutral. Years of experience had trained that instinct. I explained the situation calmly, stating only facts, nothing more. Address. Vehicle registration. Property line. Simple, verifiable truths. The officer listened, nodding slowly, his jaw tightening with each detail. She interrupted repeatedly, each time louder than before. "He's lying," she insisted. "Arrest him. That's your job." The entitlement in her voice made several neighbors exchange looks. This was no longer entertainment. It was uncomfortable. The officer finally turned to her and asked a question she clearly wasn't prepared for. "Ma'am, did you verify property boundaries before calling 911? She blinked, caught off guard. Her confidence flickered. "I shouldn't have to," she snapped. "I know my rights." That was the moment the tone shifted. The officer explained, calmly but firmly, that misuse of emergency services was a serious matter. Her face drained of color. She laughed nervously, then looked at me, searching for support that wasn't coming. I decided then it was time. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and opened it just enough for the badge to catch the light. The officer's nod became formal. His stance changed. Her eyes followed the movement. "What's that?" she asked. I met her gaze. "I'm the police chief." Silence fell over the street. Cars idled. Birds went quiet. A neighbor gasped. The woman's mouth opened, then closed, her certainty collapsing in real time. She stepped back, clutching her phone like a lifeline, suddenly aware of every witness watching. Authority had shifted without a sound. The street felt smaller, tighter, as consequences finally arrived, uninvited and undeniable. No one spoke, and even the flashing lights seemed to pause, waiting for her next move, which never came at all that afternoon moment there then. Her confidence didn't disappear all at once. It drained slowly, like air leaking from a balloon, replaced by confusion, disbelief, and then fear. She stared at the badge again, hoping it might somehow turn into something else if she looked long enough. "That's not funny," she said weakly. "You can't joke about that." "I'm not joking," I replied calmly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. The officer beside me cleared his throat and confirmed it, addressing me formally now, with respect she couldn't ignore. The shift was unmistakable. The neighbors noticed too. Phones that had been held discreetly were now fully raised. Whispers turned into murmurs. The story had flipped, And everyone felt it? Her tone changed instantly. I didn't know, she said quickly. I mean, how was I supposed to know? She laughed nervously, trying to soften the moment, trying to rewrite the last 15 minutes as a misunderstanding. This is all just a big mix-up. The officer asked her to step aside and answer a few questions. As he spoke, he explained that making false statements to emergency dispatchers was a serious offense. Her hands began to shake. She tried interrupting, apologizing now, saying she was stressed, saying she felt threatened, saying anything that might rewind time. I watched quietly. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I'd seen too many situations escalate because someone treated authority like a personal weapon. Today, that weapon had misfired. The officer asked her to explain exactly what threat she felt. She struggled. Her earlier confidence worked against her now. Every exaggerated claim unraveled under simple follow-up questions. The driveway was measured. The property line confirmed. Her story collapsed piece by piece. A neighbor finally spoke up, saying they'd watched the entire thing and confirmed my car never moved. Another nodded in agreement. Witnesses she hadn't anticipated were now part of the record. Her face flushed, not with anger this time, but embarrassment. The officer informed her she would receive a warning for misuse of emergency services, noting it would be documented. The relief on her face was immediate, though mixed with humiliation. She nodded rapidly, agreeing to everything, suddenly cooperative. Before leaving, she looked at me one last time. I'm sorry, she said quietly, no audience left to perform for. I nodded once. Apologies matter more when they're small. As the patrol car pulled away, the street slowly returned to normal. Neighbors drifted back inside. Doors closed. Curtains fell. But the lesson lingered, heavy in the air, long after the sirens were gone. By evening, the street looked the same as it always had, but it felt different to me. The incident replayed in my mind while I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the houses. What stayed with me wasn't her anger, or even the embarrassment she suffered. It was how quickly a simple lie could have spiraled into something dangerous. In my career, I'd responded to calls far worse than driveway disputes. I'd seen misunderstandings turn into tragedies because someone exaggerated, panicked, or wanted to win. Standing there as the target instead of the authority gave me a new perspective. Power, when misused, doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it looks like a phone call and a confident smile. The next morning, I noticed her curtains move as I left for work. She didn't come outside. She didn't wave. That silence said more than any apology could. News travels fast in small neighborhoods, and reputations travel even faster. By the end of the week, neighbors I barely knew were nodding at me differently, not because of my job, but because they'd witnessed restraint. At the station, the incident became a quiet teaching moment. I reminded my officers that every call, no matter how small, carries weight. That professionalism matters even when accusations are absurd. Several nodded, knowing exactly what I meant without needing details. I never filed a complaint. I didn't need to. The system had worked the way it was supposed to. She faced consequences without humiliation, and no one got hurt. That outcome mattered more than punishment. A few days later, I saw her again, this time at the mailbox. She hesitated, then gave a small, awkward nod. I returned it. No words were exchanged, but understanding passed between us. The driveway remained just a driveway. The street returned to quiet routines. But every time I park my car now, I think about that call. About how easily authority can be summoned, and how important it is to answer it with truth. Not everyone gets a second chance to learn that lesson. She did, and so did everyone watching. Moments like this remind me why calm matters more than pride, and listening matters more than being right. Authority should never be loud for its own sake. It should be steady, fair, and human, especially when emotions run high. That day could have ended with shouting, tickets, or worse. Instead, it ended with understanding, witnesses learning, and a neighborhood resetting itself. These outcomes don't go viral, but they keep people safe. And sometimes, safety is the quiet victory no one notices, except the ones who needed it most. That reality stays with me daily, guiding choices, conversations, and patience, long after cameras leave and sirens fade away slowly. A week later, the incident resurfaced in an unexpected way. I was reviewing routine reports at my desk when a note from dispatch crossed my screen. It wasn't about her, not directly. It was about a rise in neighborhood disputes being reported across the district. Parking issues, noise complaints, property line arguments. All minor on paper, but familiar in spirit. I leaned back and thought about how often frustration disguises itself as righteousness. That afternoon, I held a short briefing. Nothing dramatic. No lectures. I simply reminded my officers that many callers weren't looking for solutions, but validation. They wanted to be right, to be heard, to feel powerful in moments where they felt small. Recognizing that didn't excuse bad behavior, but it helped to escalate it. After work, I took a longer route home. I passed streets that looked just like mine. Lawns trimmed, cars parked carefully, tension hidden behind curtains. Every house carried stories no one saw. I wondered how many conflicts had quietly turned neighbors into enemies over misunderstandings that could have been solved with a conversation. When I reached my street, everything was calm. Kids rode bikes. Someone watered plants. The normalcy felt earned. I parked in the same driveway, the same spot, and stood there for a moment, listening. No shouting. No sirens. Just evening settling in. Later that night, my wife asked if the incident bothered me. I told her the truth. It did, but not for the obvious reasons. It bothered me because it reminded me how fragile trust is. How easily authority can be summoned, and how carefully it must be handled once it arrives. I didn't become a police officer to win arguments. I became one to protect people, including from themselves on bad days. That woman had a bad day. She made a bad choice. What mattered most was how it ended. A few houses down, laughter drifted through an open window. Life went on, indifferent to conflict once it passed. That's the part people forget. Drama feels permanent in the moment, but most of it dissolves if it isn't fed. Before going inside, I looked once more at the driveway. Same concrete. Same lines. Different meaning now. Not a battleground, but a reminder. Calm beats chaos. Truth outlasts noise. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand still and let reality speak for itself, without raising your voice, without flashing a badge, without proving anything to anyone watching from behind glass and curtains that slowly close as night settles in gently. The following weekend, something small but telling happened. I was trimming the hedge along the front yard when I noticed her driveway across the street. For the first time since the incident, she was outside, carefully repositioning her car, measuring the space twice before turning off the engine. It wasn't fear that guided her movements anymore. It was awareness. She glanced over at me, hesitated, then surprised us both by walking across the street. Each step looked deliberate, like she was rehearsing what to say. When she stopped a few feet away, there was no anger left in her face. Just discomfort and resolve. I wanted to apologize again, she said. Not just for calling 911, but for how I acted. I set the trimmer down and listened. She explained she'd been overwhelmed, dealing with things she didn't share, and that day had pushed her past reason. It wasn't an excuse, and she didn't present it as one. It was context. For the first time, she spoke like a neighbor, not an accuser. I thanked her for saying it. I told her something I rarely say outside the job, that escalation often begins long before police arrive. With stress. With assumptions. With choosing confrontation over conversation. She nodded, eyes down, absorbing it. That brief exchange did more to restore the street than any warning ever could. Word spread, not as gossip this time, but as reassurance. The neighborhood felt lighter. People waved again. Kids played without parents watching nervously. Tension dissolved into routine. Later that day, I thought about how rarely these stories end quietly. Online, they're edited for outrage, frozen at their worst moment. But real life keeps going. People learn. Sometimes they even change. At work, I shared the interaction with my command staff. Not as a victory, but as a reminder that policing doesn't end when the call clears. It continues in how communities feel afterward. Respect isn't demanded. It's built slowly, through consistency and restraint. That evening, I parked in the driveway and smiled at how ordinary it looked again. No audience. No flashing lights. Just concrete and fading sunlight. The same setting, but a different outcome than what could have been. Some lessons don't arrive with consequences loud enough to satisfy spectators. They arrive quietly, settling into habits and choices. Those are the lessons that last. That day reminded me that authority reveals character on both sides. Hers, in how she owned her mistake. Mine, in how I responded when I didn't have to prove anything. And the neighborhood's, in how it chose calm over conflict once the noise faded. Weeks passed, and life on the street settled into its usual rhythm. The shouting, the sirens, and the tension became a memory, like a storm that left behind only the smell of rain. Yet, even in calm, the incident lingered in subtle ways, shaping interactions and expectations. Neighbors walked past each other with a little more courtesy, conversations were tempered with a touch more patience, and even small disagreements were met with a pause rather than an immediate reaction. One afternoon, I noticed her again, the woman who had called 911. She was outside, tending to her garden. No phone in hand, no dramatic gestures, just quiet, focused work. Her posture had softened, her movements deliberate and careful, as if she understood that authority was not something to challenge lightly. When our eyes met, she gave a small nod, a gesture that acknowledged the past without needing words. I nodded back. There was no triumph, no humiliation, just mutual recognition that life had moved forward. It struck me how quickly perspective can change when pride and performance are removed from the equation. She wasn't the same person who had stormed my driveway with a phone pressed to her ear. I wasn't the same officer who had quietly measured patience against entitlement. Time had cooled tempers, and reflection had reshaped behavior. It was remarkable how ordinary life resumed after extraordinary conflict, and how ordinary people, when given a chance, can choose humility over spectacle. Later that evening, I shared the story with a few trusted friends, not as gossip, but as an illustration of human behavior. We talked about accountability, the weight of authority, and the responsibility that comes with power. We laughed at the absurdity of the scenario, but also recognized the lessons embedded in it. Sometimes, the most important moments aren't the dramatic ones, they're the quiet ones that follow, the ones that shape character. Driving home, I passed other neighborhoods that were similar to mine, each with its own unspoken tensions. I thought about how many small disputes go unresolved, escalating into grudges or conflicts that leave lasting scars. And I realized that our street had been lucky not because rules were enforced or sirens sounded, but because patience, truth, and perspective had prevailed. That night, I parked in my driveway again and looked around the neighborhood bathed in soft streetlight. The houses were quiet. The cars were still. And for the first time since the incident, Everything felt exactly as it should: peaceful, ordinary, and grounded in lessons quietly learned. Confirm if you want me to continue to chapter 9. Continue. Months had passed since that unforgettable day, yet its lessons remained vivid. The neighborhood had returned to its calm routine, but the memory of confrontation lingered, not as tension, but as a subtle reminder of accountability, perspective, and restraint. I often thought about how quickly situations can escalate when assumptions replace facts, and how easily people can be swept into drama without realizing it. One quiet afternoon, as I stepped out onto my driveway to fetch the mail, I noticed her across the street. She waved tentatively, a far cry from the dramatic gestures she once relied on. I waved back. No words were needed. The tension had been replaced by an unspoken understanding that respect and awareness mattered more than proving a point. Life had resumed, ordinary but enriched by the lessons learned. I reflected on the entire chain of events: the initial anger, the 911 call, the arrival of law enforcement, and the revelation that I was the police chief. At every step, the situation could have spiraled out of control. It could have ended with accusations, fines, or public embarrassment. Instead, it ended with accountability, dialogue, and personal reflection. This wasn't a story about power, it was a story about responsibility. Neighbors now approached with small greetings, often referencing the incident with humor or curiosity. It had become a subtle cautionary tale how entitlement can backfire when faced with facts and composure. The woman who once stormed my driveway had grown more cautious, but I also believed she had grown more thoughtful. People are capable of change when given the opportunity and time to reflect. At the station, I shared the story as a teaching example, emphasizing patience, communication, and measured response. I reminded the team that every call, no matter how trivial it seems, carries real consequences. The lessons weren't about punishment, they were about understanding, empathy, and handling conflicts with calm authority. Stories like this didn't need headlines. They needed perspective. That evening, as I parked my car and stood for a moment on the driveway, I realized something important: authority is only as strong as the restraint with which it is exercised. Power is fleeting, patience and truth endure. And sometimes, the most meaningful victories aren't those recorded in reports or captured on cameras, they're the quiet ones that restore balance, teach humility, and allow communities to move forward peacefully. As I stepped inside, I glanced back at the driveway one last time. Concrete, lines, and parked cars, everything unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, a story of lessons learned, tempers cooled, and lives slightly better for the experience. That day had passed, but its impact had not. And in that silence, the neighborhood was at peace.